All right, guys, welcome to the OWC Jam in the Van live. We're going to break down a mix from Marcus King Band. Rita is Gone. So what I first want to do is this was a great session we did back in 2016. I just want to play a little bit of the song and then we'll break it down and kind of start building up the mix from scratch. So here's a little bit of the song.
Hey, we're the Marcus King Band. This is Jam in the Van, and this is a tune called Rita is Gone. She was surrounded while she was alone. When did my house become a mess of a home? She was so tired, but her house remained open. So much.
All right, now a bunch of you guys are already familiar with this track. It's a phenomenal track. The first thing I want to point out is the band is really phenomenal on this. So when we have bands in Jam in the Van, the better the band is dynamically within itself, the better it is a job for mixing. So Marcus King, phenomenal vocalist and guitar player. So the raw tracks themselves were great. So what we're going to do is now I'm going to open up the original session that has no plugins or anything on it. We're going to take a look at that. So give me 1 second. Okay, guys, so this is the original track. I put it in from the beginning again. Now I've also loaded in the track that I mixed already, so you can kind of hear where it's going. We're going to try to rebuild that up from the beginning. Okay, guys, so the first thing that I ever do with the mix is I try to find a good area of the song that I'm just going to put on a loop and kind of get a natural balance with everything. So let's go to what is like kind of the first chorus of this. We're going to find that. I always try to find an area of the song that's very loud dynamically right at the beginning. So this kind of area I can kind of see is, we're going to start where it sees.
Freedom is gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime.
Okay, so we're going to start the loop right there. So I'm going to start right where the downbeat is. Now let's kind of see where this section ends. Okay, so now we got kind of the full section, and I'm going to start putting it on loop. So I'm going to go back and forth between the mix that I already did and kind of the reference. So there is a lot different, but the first thing now that I'm going to go through with the raw audio tracks is start leveling everything out. So we're going to look at the drums first. There we go. I always try to get the kick at round unity gain when I do it. So I'm going to clip gain this. We'll pull this up. So notice that it is significantly lower than I want in the track. I'm going to take the entire track and just up it up. There we go. 1 second. So now let's level out the entire drums. I try to keep all of my faders at unity gain. It works well for Pro Tools just for gain structuring all the way down. So let's now add the snare. It is well significantly lower, so we're going to bring that up. Okay, now when I'm looking at the floor toms and the rack toms, I like to pan everything really wide. The wider I pan it, the better the stereo image. A lot of amateur mixes that I see, they don't pan things nearly as wide as they should. So I'm going to take these toms and pan them hard right and hard left. We're going to add those in. Now we're going to add the overheads. So that's a little bit loud for me, so I'm going to again clip gain that down. Okay, we have a question from the audience. Ooh, that is an excellent question. So we're having a question about, how far we want to put the relationship with the other instruments, with the drums, the bass, the guitar, and stuff like that. So we're going to get to that in just a second. What I tend to do at the beginning is I get one instrument. The drums is the most complex because it's multiple instruments, but all performed by the same person. So once we balance that out, then I will start to balance everything with the drums, and then kind of start soloing and EQing and compressing along the way. So I hope that answered the question. If you have more of it, I'll go a little bit deeper into that in a second. So we're going to add the overheads back in. Okay, so this right here is kind of a balance that I'm pretty happy with the drums. So the next thing I'm going to do is bring up the bass. So right now we're literally just gain structuring the entire session to make sure that it sounds kind of good at a flat level. Let's pull up the bass. Okay, so we're going to now solo the drums and the bass. Let me group the drums here. So if you can see right here on the screen, I try to get the kick and the snare right at 0. This is going to give me enough headroom so that I can make sure that the master fader, when I start limiting it, will give enough dynamic range. And then with the bass, as you can see right now, it's right around -22, but what we're going to do is bring it up. So I try to get it around -16 just so it barely gets into the yellow. So let me do that. We're still a little bit low. Let's bring it up a little bit more. Okay, great. So now that we have the bass kind of in there, we're going to start going down the line. I've got the guitar, keys, and then 2 saxes, and then the lead vocal. So let's bring in the guitar. Right now it's labeled guitar center, but a lot of times, even if it's center, I'm going to pan it out a little bit just to create a little bit more of a stereo depth. So let's bring in his guitar. So now based on this knowing, I know where the sax and the trumpet are when we were watching the video. They're more on the left. I'm just, for the sake of the mix, going to bring the guitar a little bit off to the right so that it's going to allow more stereo imaging once I add the sax and the trumpet. Okay, now we're going to add in the keys. So in a minute, we're going to add a stereo widener to the keys, but right now we're going to kind of leave it where it's at. Now let's add the sax and the trumpet in. That's a pretty good balance already, but again, I'm going to pan it out to the left to create more depth for the, especially the most important thing, the lead vocal, Marcus. Okay, now lastly, we're going to pull up the lead vocal.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime.
So as you can see, Marcus right here, I'm going to zoom in on the waveform. He has a lot of he has great vocal dynamic control. So it's not going to need a lot of compression on his voice to get it to sit well in the mix, but it's looking pretty good right now. So now the last two things that we have are the background vocals. Let's actually look in here. They've been recorded. Let's see if we can't find an area where they're singing. We're going to solo those. Okay, we have another question. What's the question, Jack? Oh, that's a great question. He's wondering about how everything was mic'd. Everything was mic'd, so we have a system in the van. It's controlled by a great engineer named Ethan Glaze. And so to point that out, we have microphones were endorsed by Audio-Technica. And microphones on all the instruments. The bass was run DI, I believe through an orange amp at the time. Let me pull that up. Yep, we got a direct bass DI, and then I believe the keys we were running direct too. Let me pull that up. Now it sounds like we had a cabinet for the keys that we were then miking. We can reach out to Ethan and find the exact microphones. It may have changed because the session was 4 years ago, but most likely, I know they were Audio-Technica back then. So to keep moving forward, now let's go to, I'm trying to find if there are background vocals. There might not be in this specific track. We did record them, I think, for the other session, the other songs in the session. Okay, so right now I'm not really hearing background vocals, so we're going to come back to that in a second. But, so now let's go back to our little loop that we have. I'm going to let this play for a second.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Said she gone.
So just a couple things. I'm going to bring down the guitar a little bit. It's still a little bit too loud to me. But now that I've kind of got a baseline for all of my tracks, I'm going to start going in depth with each instrument and really start to refine it and then dial them all back in with each other. But before we do that, I want to just take a quick break and, again, thank OWC. They're a great sponsor of ours. They have really high quality hard drives. I mean, I've been using OWC way before we ever even had a partnership with them. And they're very fast, very reliable. I have a whole case. I triple back up all of the audio files on the projects I work on, and they're all in OWC. So, okay, so now we're going to go back to it. So now that we have kind of a good balance, I'm going to go into the kick, go back into the drums. We're going to start doing some EQ and basic compression on all these different instruments. So let's pull up the kick. All right, guys, so the first thing I'm hearing, this sounds a little bit boxy. So now you're not going to be able to hear it at home because we're just taking a direct feed to the computer, but I have 3 different sets of monitors that I work from: Adams A77X, Yamaha NS10s, and Aratones, the small little mix cubes right there. A lot of times when I start doing mixes, I will actually start with the Aratones. I'm going to switch over to those. They're a lot smaller. They only have one woofer, and so because of that, I don't get the full spectrum, which is actually good when it comes to kind of dialing in certain sounds. So I'm going to play that loop again, and I'm going to start to dial in the kick drum a little bit. So I'm definitely hearing a little bit of a boxiness right around 175, so I'm going to bring that down. Now I'm going to boost the low end because I remember, I think this was back when we had a lot smaller of a kick in Jam in the Van. So I'm going to boost this up. So now not all the kick EQ that I do will always be the same. It really does depend on the drummer that is playing, how they're kicking the drum. But so we're going to bypass before and after. Okay, now that I've got a little bit of EQ on it, I'm going to actually take that and I'm going to start to compress it. So as you can see, the normal EQ that I use a lot of times is either the built-in EQ in Pro Tools, I think it's phenomenal, or I'll use the Fab Filter EQ. But now we're going to go to compressor. Most of the time, the first compressor that I use on the kick will be a 1176. It's really good at picking up the transient, so I'm going to put that in again. Okay, now this is kind of one of my favorite plugins that I use a lot. It's one, I'm just going to pull it up real quick. It's made by Plugin Alliance. It's called a Transient Designer. So when I'm hearing this, I hear the sustain of the kick. It's a little bit too long. So what this plugin will do is I'll be able to adjust the sustain in the attack. So I'm going to do that to make it a little bit shorter to be able to especially work well with the bass. Okay, so here's before and after. Okay, now you're going to hear what that sounds like, especially in context with the bass. Okay, so let's move right on down the road. Now we're going to go to the snare. And the snare, I'm going to do a similar thing. I'm going to EQ it, compress it, and probably mess with it with a Transient Designer. Again, when I start, I go back to my aura tones. I love EQing and just kind of getting an overall balance on those. So we're going to EQ this on the aura tones. So right there, I hear a little bit of a resonance that's right around 583. I try to make the snares always a little bit more dead in terms of the resonance. So we're going to EQ that down. Now we're going to boost the highs a little bit. Okay, now again, a lot of the times I'll treat these instruments the same, so I'm going to just copy over the same compressor, but I'm going to adjust kind of the threshold on it to make sure that it hits it right where it's about 3 decibels of gain reduction. Same thing with the Transient Designer. Now that to me, this seems to be a little bit too much sustain taking out, so I'm going to bring that up just a little bit. Great, now we're going to move to the overheads. Same thing, a lot of these instruments I'm doing kind of the same thing. I'm listening to them, EQing them, compressing them, and then bringing them back into the balance. So I'm going to do that real quick on the overheads. Okay, and then we're going to add a compressor. Okay, one thing that's always important to do on your drums, make sure that they're phase compliant. So what that means is a lot of plugins, the distance of microphones is going to be whether or not a microphone is in phase or out of phase with each other. Especially when we have multiple microphones in the van, I always check the phase, whether it's in phase or out of phase by using, as you can see right here, a phase adjuster. So we're going to pull up the snare, and I'm going to simply use my ears, and I'm going to go between the and see which one sounds more full. So when I put it out of phase, to me it's a little bit of a more full sound, so I'm going to do that and then adjust it back into the mix. Okay, so now we're going to move forward. We're going to go somewhat quick so we can get through everything. This process, I would go a lot more in depth. It wouldn't just be this quick. I would go through and make sure that everything kind of really sounded the way I want. But we're going to go now to the bass. So it's kind of already a nice full sounding bass. So again, we're going to EQ and compress. Okay, now one of my favorite compressors that I love using on the bass, and I actually have an analog version of it, is the LA2A. But right now, for the sake of everyone seeing it, I'm going to just do the digital version of that. Okay, now we're going to bring that back down again in context with the bass. I'm sorry, the drums. Okay, now already I'm kind of hearing the overheads are a little bit too loud, so again, I'm going to bring those down. So next, let's go to the guitar. Do the same thing, EQ and compression. So now, after years of doing the mixes for Jam in the Van, I always find that there are certain frequencies that are building up in the van, especially right around 1K. Right here, it's around 910, and then also around the double of that, so around 2K. So a lot of times, and this is just the bleed of especially the cymbals into everything and the high end on the guitars. So I'm going to do the difference between that. Okay, we have another question from Jack. Okay, the question is, why don't I use EQ presets? A lot of times because every instrument is different. I know that a lot of different plugins, including Pro Tools and Logic, will have presets for voice or kick or bass or stuff like that. I've just found through the years, you know, when I first started out, when I literally was first doing this, presets were a great resource. Now I don't like to use them because I try to figure out the context of what I want to do with the instrument in the track. And so what we'll do, I'm going to actually pull up this way. I'm going to show you how I EQ the guitar, and then I'm going to pull up a preset. So we're going to do the way I EQ it, and then we can show the preset and kind of see the difference. Ultimately, it's a thing you have to use trial and error. You have to use your ear to see what you feel is going to be the best for the instrument. So now we're going to do the EQ on the guitar, and then I'll pull up a preset with what they have built in with Pro Tools. Now, a lot of the way that I always EQ, is you can kind of tell in general, below a certain frequency, I'll always EQ by subtraction. This is a lot more phase compliant. It doesn't create the problems with phase inside of an instrument. So now I'm going to bypass this, and I'm going to actually pull up another EQ, and we're going to pull up, let's see what Pro Tools recommends for the EQ on the guitar. We're going to try add byte 2. Okay, so these are just, as you can see, very basic. This is add clarity. So this is kind of something that I would use. This is a little bit similar to what I would use. I like using a high pass on a lot of instruments because you really don't need anything below a certain level. So we're going to pull up, let's see what this sounds like. I'll pull up mine. Bypass theirs. So as you can see, it's kind of a similar EQ curve to what they have as a built-in preset. Hitting a few different frequencies, but again, it's that idea of you have to use your ears ultimately. So I mean, I would recommend if you're starting literally from zero, use presets, but the more you can get out of it, I would highly recommend it. So again, we're gonna pull this into, we're gonna add a compressor. Okay, so in general, I'm going to pull up multiple compressors. I don't try to compress any sort of instrument more than about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction. Let me show you what it sounds like when you over compress. I'm going to make this very noticeably compressed. So we're really kind of messing with the dynamics there. So I'm going to make it so whereas you see on the needle, it only goes down to about minus 2 to 3 dB. Okay, now we're going to add the drums back in. Okay, now let's go to the keys. As I said at the very beginning, this is a mono key. It was mic'd on the cabinet, and so what I always end up like doing is adding a stereo whitener to make it kind of really have a big field of space. So we're going to pull that up. Now the one I like using on this, sometimes I do use presets I go to a lot. This is spread high frequency diffusion. I don't like to have the low end kind of spread out, but I want to make the high end kind of like nice and big within the context of the mix. So I'll do before and after. Again, just like everything else, I'm going to EQ it and compress it. So we'll pull up another EQ. now let's add a compressor. A lot of the times, seriously, as you can see through this, I'm using a lot of the same plugins. I'm using a stock Pro Tools plugin. It's very phenomenal. A lot of the CLA compressors, I found them very versatile. And I'm not really kind of going too far out. You know, it's again, it's how you use the plugins, how you use the tools, not the specific ones that you have. Oh, well, I mean, that's a great question. Asking the difference, the biggest difference between mixing in the van or mixing a band from the van and a live studio recording, or a recording in the studio context. The biggest thing that I have to deal with, and I'm going to go into it a little bit once we get into the vocals, is the bleed between all of the different instruments. As I said at the beginning of the stream, why this mix came out phenomenally well was not necessarily because of me, but because of the dynamics that the band played inside the van. The drums is a very, very important aspect of this. If the drummer is playing especially too loud in context of the vocals, it's very hard to balance that out. And so this band was really good dynamically. And I also have to think about it this way. The vocal mic is not just vocals. It also has bleed from drums and the other instruments in it as well. And so the main difference I would say is that this, I have to, even though I have isolated tracks with everything in the van, I have to kind of consider it as one at the same level too. And so a lot of times I will EQ the drums, but then once I add the vocals, I find that the drums are now too bright. So I have to go back to the drums and make them a little bit darker so that they work in context with the vocals and everything else. So we're going to kind of, you'll hear that in a second more when I get to the vocals especially. But now let's add the keys into the kind of context of the mix that we have. Now, a lot of times I'll mix the keys a little bit lower than the guitars and stuff like that, because a lot of times they have like a pad like thing, like this is a B3 organ, so the overall level can be a little bit lower. It doesn't need to be as much up front. Okay, now let's go to the sax and the trumpet. Now again, saxophone and trumpets, or horns in general, can be very tricky to mix because they're very, very dynamic. And as we've even seen in this mix, they will play really, really quietly, and then they can play really, really loud. And so we have to kind of take that into context, especially with something like a trumpet. But let's kind of, again, EQ and compress and kind of bring it back into the mix. Now, a lot of this, like where I'm EQing, is very dependent on the speakers that I have in front of me and my listening environment. So it's very important that you have an accurate listening environment to do this. That's, you know, I would really take that I would have 3 sets of speakers as opposed to one amazing set of speaker. I'll also listen to things on headphones and stuff like that. So it might sound different when I'm EQing it here, but again, I'm mixing to the reference that most people will listen to stuff on. And again, let's add some compression. Copy that. Okay, now just for the sake of time, I've been told we have about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to the rest of the mix and kind of get it sounding good with adding some effects and everything like that. So I'm going to quickly bypass the trumpet. I'm going to add the same EQ and compression. Of course, I would do it a little bit differently for the trumpet because it's a different instrument. But for the sake of time, we're just going to add that in real quick. Okay, now let's get to the most important thing in the mix, in my opinion. I mean, I was taught as a drummer, and so I, of course, think drums are very important. But the real most important thing in the mix is the lead vocal, right? And making sure that the clarity of the lyrics and everything is forefront. So now this is where I'll spend a lot of time on the mix, and we're going to go through it pretty fast. But again, it's the same thing. EQ, compress. We might do some things like de-essing, making sure the sibilance isn't loud. So let's see how this sounds by itself.
Gone. She ain't coming back. And you're
Okay, so we're going to add some EQ.
gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. She's gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Gone. She ain't coming back.
Okay, guys, so one thing that I'll do, especially on vocals, is they can be very dynamic. I'm actually going to do multiple compressors, and I do this on a lot of instruments, but especially vocals. So I'll pull up some of my favorite compressors that I'll kind of do in a chain. I'm going to do it real quick just to kind of get it in the level so we can get to adding some effects and really making this thing pop in the mix.
Gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Gone. Gone.
Again, guys, before we go on a little bit, I do want to, again, talk about OWC. I absolutely love using their products. I have an OWC solid-state hard drive in my laptop. I actually make sure, and it's phenomenal because I load all the audio files into the hard drive, which makes it super smooth, no errors when it comes to it. Very, again, very reliable, and they're just great at, like, workhorses when it comes to, you know, hard drives in the studio. So we're going to keep going here.
Gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Say she gone. Gone. She ain't coming back.
Okay, now I've got everything kind of EQ and compressed a little bit, so now I'm going to dial it in a little bit further, and then we're going to add some effects. This is where it really will bring it to life. So when I'm listening to it initially right here, I'm hearing the keys are a little bit too loud. So let me play it again.
Gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Say she gone. She won't wait for you.
Okay, great, guys. One other thing I'm going to do quickly. I end up doing this a lot. It's phenomenal for vocals. I'll add a multi-band compressor, especially because we always use dynamic microphones on the vocals. I can always hear that they're always a little bit more low-end heavy on certain syllables. So I'm going to actually pull that up real quick.
Gone.
And I can isolate that mid-frequency and just compress it. So we're going to see what that sounds like.
Gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Say she gone. Gone.
Okay, now in context of the mix.
Gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Say she gone.
Okay, guys, so I'm kind of happy with where this mix is right now. So now we're going to start adding some effects to really give it depth. Now, the one thing I'm going to pull up here on the screen, this is kind of my mix template that I have ready to go. As you can see, let's see, it looks like I have about 13 different effects just ready to go. All I have to do is send it as send. I have multiple room reverbs. We also have plates, delays, and a lot of different things to really kind of give it some depth. So when I pull up the reference mix, I'll pull up what we had before. So I can definitely hear him doing kind of like a room reverb on his vocal and then also a delay. So we're going to try to emulate that right now. She ain't coming back. Okay, let's add a little bit of a delay. So now there's two different types of delays, kind of normally used in mixes, a slap delay and a time delay. So the nature of this music, I'm going to use a slap delay, which is more of kind of like a in-your-face old sound, as opposed to a time delay, which you use for a lot of pop. Gone. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. Okay, now we're going to add a little bit of some depth with a little bit of a medium-sized reverb. I have a true verb here with a New York plate. I'm going to pull up I'm just going to pull up the plugin so you can see it. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. So then we're going to add some more on that. I'm going to isolate the vocal so you can really hear it. She ain't coming back. Now a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take the same reverb and I'll have different decay times for each of the reverbs, so that it'll kind of create a nice steady decay. So right now this is at the first one. Let's see where we have it at. The first decay time is at 1.2 seconds, as you can see right there. And then the second one is at 3.8, substantially longer. So I'm going to show what that happens when we add both of them. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. She ain't coming back. Okay, so we've got some reverb on the lead vocal, but now we kind of need to do the similar thing to all the other instruments. So I'm going to go through real quick and start adding some reverb on the drums and everything else in general. Okay, now we're going to add some reverb real quickly to the rest of the instruments. Again, I would do different reverbs, different levels, but to just kind of get this so that we can get an overall idea of the process, I'm going to do it pretty quickly. Okay, guys, so now we got kind of an overall mix. I'm going to play it with and without effects so you can kind of really hear the stark difference. So this is without effects. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. And with. She ain't coming back in your lifetime. All right, guys, so now once we have that set up and I'm kind of happy with the mix, what I'll now end up doing in the process is limiting it, kind of preparing it for release, this especially on YouTube. So now I have my master fader, and what I'm going to do is go through, and I kind of have a preset of different limiters that I'll put on it to kind of give it that nice extra loudness. Now what I'm going to do out there for you is every time I make it a little bit louder, I'm going to actually bring it down so it doesn't blast you guys too much on your end, but you kind of get the idea. Okay, guys, I like doing multiple limiters as opposed to one. So right now I just put my first, this one is the linear MB from Waves, and we're going to add another Waves one. This will bring it up substantially in volume.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime. She ain't.
Add another limiter. We'll just keep adding them.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime.
Okay, now the last thing that I'll do, I'm going to add one more real quick. It's a multi-band limiter that I'm able to kind of EQ and kind of get the overall sound that I want.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime.
So now let's kind of compare that to the mix that we were at before.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime.
Okay, so one of the things I'm noticing right away from our original mix, I would go back in and kind of adjust, especially the transients on the kick to really get it going. The last thing I do before I ever release anything is I make sure the overall LUFS level. I have this great meter that will kind of check the level and make sure that it's loud enough for the different streaming services in YouTube and stuff such as that. So let's check out where we're kind of at.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime.
So kind of actually base where we're at. We're at above -10. It's a little bit too loud. I've limited it a little bit too much. So I'm going to start backing off on some of these limiters.
She ain't coming back in your lifetime. She ain't coming back.
So that's getting a little bit closer. So this is kind of in a quick little presentation. The process, we go a lot more in depth with, of course, every song and everything like that. But to get something from recorded in the van out to you guys and YouTube on the different streaming platforms as well. So I hope this was informative, and we might be doing some new ones in the future. And again, I want to thank OWC for their support with Jam in the Van. They've been very helpful to me and the other video people doing post to be able to store our files. They're very secure, very fast, and very good at doing what they do. So thanks, guys. And if you have any questions, hit us up at Jam in the Van or me at my Instagram, Sean P. Jones. Right. Peace, guys. Talk to you later.
She ain't coming back. Says she gone.